Hello, I'm Kads, and welcome to today's video. So just in time, the day before we have the new Fusion beginning, I did manage to finish the Ace Reporter Titan event, and April O'Neil is mine on my account. So all the way through, up and through milestone 5. So in this video, I'm going to be breaking down some of the details behind how I managed to pull this off. And more importantly, I wanted to highlight that I have a new tool in my spreadsheet, which will be linked in the description box down below. And we're going to go through that a little bit later. Now, for those of you who might be newer to the channel, I do always post a summary after every single Fusion and also after every single Titan event, talking about my supply deltas from the beginning till the end in terms of silver, gems, and shards, and also just summarizing all what it took in order to complete a Titan event and or a Fusion. So by the time you're watching this video, that post is already live on my community tab page. So if you want to see a little bit more detail on the specific numbers for those elements, then I refer you to that post to go into that. But in this case, I want to just talk in general about the Titan event and my overall strategy when it comes to tackling certain events. So we'll go kind of not line by line necessarily, but kind of go through a lot of the events that encompassed the Titan event and talk about how I approach them individually. So popping into the tool spreadsheet, once again, this will be linked in the description box down below. This is the same spreadsheet that also has all of the Fusion plans, pending obviously the new Fusion coming up tomorrow. I'll be filling that out as we go along. Fusion Potion Calculator, Heroes Path Calculator, Deck of Fate Calculator, all these different tools all combined in one spreadsheet. So be sure to check out each of the tabs if you do look into the spreadsheet, again linked in the description box down below. But today our focus is going to be on the Titan event log. So the structure, of course, is fairly similar to that of the Fusion plans, but in this case this is less prescriptive, meaning that we don't have the schedule ahead of time, and we just went in during the course of the Titan event and kind of filled in the boxes for each of the events that we happened to see. So let's kind of go through some of the things that are notable. One thing to mention, of course, Fusions are typically nowadays around 2 weeks. This Titan event went through 18 days, so somewhere closer to 3 weeks. And ordinarily for a Fusion, we would just have a 4 dungeon split, meaning 1 dungeon tournament for each of the core dungeons. But in this case, you can see we had 1 ice golem. When it's 2 days, you'll know that this is a turn attack, meaning that you have a much shorter time to do it, but it's a lot easier to do because it's based on the amount of turns you complete the dungeon in and the highest level you can do, versus a 3-day event, which is your standard tournament where you just have to get to whatever the milestone is, and thus you can go from there. And yeah, so we have a couple of turn attacks here, more so in the beginning, but near the end it switched to regular tournaments for the core dungeons. We also have 2 event dungeon tournaments in the mix. Sometimes we see those for Fusions in more recent days, but not always. It kind of just depends on how they fall. But for event dungeons, they definitely seem to be incorporating those more into Titan events. We have 2 classic arena tournaments, which are always pretty straightforward and easy to get through. We had 1 champion training tournament. We had a champion chase tournament. There's always going to be some shard summoning involved in this one. However, it being consolidated into 300 points for the champion chase is a little bit on the higher end. I think usually we see it around 200 or so. So we kind of saved a bit of time where the event didn't go on as long, and we just had less events in general, less events overlapping with one another. But a lot of the points were consolidated into a handful of core events. That we had 2 dedicated Gear Hunters events, one at the beginning and one at the end, which is a little bit nicer because you get to you don't have to worry as much about trying to spend a bunch of gems on Gear Hunters, which is typically the pitfall when it comes to spending gems. We had 3 gear enhancement events, which is pretty par for the course, and then we had a champion training event as well. There was no dedicated summon rush. However, the summon rush aspect of this, the shard pulling aspect, the summon rush aspect, was encompassed in the Heroes Path. Granted, once again, this is a higher milestone than we've typically seen even in a Heroes Path. Usually, I would say maybe 250 to 300 points is what we normally see. So 400 again is on the higher side, but it is noticeable that this did include also a Gear Hunters event. So you can think of it as there being 3 Gear Hunters events, but this was semi-dedicated because you could have just bypassed this by just using a bunch of shards and not doing any dungeons. So make of that what you will. And then we had, of course, the Hothead Deck of Fate, which was a guaranteed event for Raphael in the mix, which is Soul Stones. And then the last thing here, Fusion Warm-Up event near the end, where it's just kind of free. You do a little bit of, I think, champion training in this case in order to get the last set of points. So the main things to highlight here in terms of the milestones are just kind of for the record, this will help us get an idea of what more events in the future are going to look like. And so one thing you'll notice is that the milestones differ in terms of the turn attacks here, like the first two, Ice Golem and Fire Knight. They're not the same, whereas for a fusion, it's pretty standard. You're going to see 2250 across the board, across all the core dungeons. But for these, they tend to vary the values based on the relative difficulty of the dungeon. So Fire Knight is a little bit more, or maybe not the difficulty, the popularity, I should say, of the dungeon. So Fire Knight is a little bit higher because people want Savage, they want Stun, they want Shield, and they want Regen. And Ice Golem is a bit lower because people just care less, even though I still value Retaliation, Cursed, and Reflex and whatnot. But, you know, over in aggregate, it is less popular of a dungeon. And then for the regular tournaments, you notice that the milestone is a lot lower, 1525. So it's just, you know, maybe 2 days worth of grinding versus a full 3 days worth of grinding relative to a fusion, depending on how you like to do those. But by contrast, the Dragon tournament was a little bit more expensive when it comes to the turn attack. But again, that's, you know, I think there was a drop Frenzy on speed or drop Fever on speed. So that was a little bit more enticing, perhaps. And then 2050 is a little bit higher of the milestone for a regular tournament, but and notably higher than the 1500 from the previous ones. So just kind of the values vary. That's kind of the point I wanted to make here. So it's not as fixed and not as consistent as when it comes to fusions. By contrast, however, it seems to be relatively consistent when it comes to the event dungeons. Both of those were 1900. So I will be expecting that going forward in the future. Same thing for Classic Arena. That's pretty par for the course. 390 points is pretty standard. That's the same for fusions as well. For the champion training, these values are pretty much par for the course. Again, relative to fusions, somewhere in the 2000-ish range for the first milestone, somewhere in the 6000 range for the second milestone. These can definitely vary. They've been higher, they've been lower, so that's just kind of in flux. But the ballpark is somewhere in that vein. When it comes to champion chases, even if they do happen to encompass a fusion event, which sometimes they do, in this case it didn't, for at least for this champion chase, 4,000 points is usually where the Titan events points go, and the fusions usually top out at 3,000, 3,500, 2,500, somewhere around there. So it is definitely expected for the Titan event points to be a little bit higher than your standard amount for a fusion. But you'll note here that in this case, 1550 is pretty much usually where the lower milestone is if there were fusion aspects of this in a champion chase. But the 4,200 is par for the course relative to Titan events. When it comes to the Gear Hunters events, typically I think they do just one node near the end, maybe two nodes, but in this case they split it up into 3 nodes. So there's a really, really low one at 55 or 550, which is nice. But the bulk of the points, I think this is worth 10 out of the 80. So the 70 points was at the higher milestones. But 1550 for the middle and then 3350 for the end, which this isn't the worst form of Dungeon Divers because, when you're doing a standard dungeon tournament overlapping with the Dungeon Divers, you're going to get a lot more points relative to the dungeon tournament than you are for Dungeon Divers, which is why we always say the Dungeon Divers is a terrible, event in terms of points. But nonetheless, this is nicer than a fusion because normally for a fusion, we'd see just a single milestone all the way out at 3,700, which means you're going to have to go a lot or far above and beyond what a typical dungeon tournament would require in order to get that done. So these would definitely cost you a little bit extra gems relative to their respective dungeon tournaments, but not as much as when it comes to a fusion. When it comes to gear enhancement, though, these are typically more expensive than fusions. There's one exception in this particular Titan event where 4775 is the standard amount that we see for fusions. There's typically 3 in every fusion nowadays, at least. But for this one, you can see we had a 5600 at the beginning and a 5600 near the end. So again, typically they are going to be more expensive than a fusion in terms of the amount of points you're going to need to go all the way out and get all the points, which then can equate to you spending, on average more silver just because, there's 1,000 more points that you need to get. The champion training events, just like the tournament, these are around these typical values we've seen for fusions and whatnot. So usually the lower milestone is somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000. The upper milestone can be upwards of 7,000, but I would say typically it's more closer to the 6,000-ish range. However, I think maybe some fusions have gone all the way out to like 9,000 points before. So there is some precedence for higher values. The fusion warm-up, like I mentioned, is just kind of a par for the course. It's pretty easy. You either do a little bit of artifact enhancement, a little bit of champion training, or you open some mystery shards and you get that done. So that's never really a concern. But nonetheless, it is worth noting that a fusion warm-up event is typically a good way to get the last few points or some of the points in the Titan event, usually near the end. And then we have the Hero's Path here, which is always a crapshoot. It could be soul stones, it could be shards and soul stones, it could be whatever. There's never really a good predictor of what these are going to look like. We have no idea what the paths are going to be. We have no idea what the rewards are going to be or where they're going to be located. Are they going to be behind keys? Are they not going to be behind keys? So that's definitely kind of an open book as far as it goes. But nonetheless, we'll kind of see how these are typically going to be laid out in the future. But of course, there's always going to be a dedicated video on my channel for a free-to-play review review specifically on my channel for Heroes Paths and other such types of specific events. And then we had the Deck of Fate here, 100 points up for grabs on that one. That's pretty standard, but in this case, this one is, you could argue it's a little bit more special because there's also a guaranteed champion in the mix, but notably the cost here was soul stones instead of shards or any other type of event. The last thing that I think is worth mentioning here is that the energy focus here at the very bottom is just a summary of where my energy was focused over the course of the Titan event. So you can see there's a decent mix of all of the core dungeons, and there's not that much overlap between certain things. So you can see I started with Fire Knight. It was only 2 days, so I cranked that out. Then I switched to the event dungeon a little bit before it began, but Dungeon Divers or Gear Hunters was already live, so I kind of preempted that and started farming the event dungeon early. Champion training got a head start here. Did all of the dragon, you can see, turn attack tournament in 1 day. That's pretty standard for me, at least in the end game. I'm able to do those because I'm farming relatively high stages relatively quickly. So turn attacks, I can usually turn them around in a single day. Champion training kind of continued on. Ice Golem, same thing. It was another turn attack. Turn that around in a single day on the last day. A little bit of Spider here. I had 2 full days without champion training, so I could focus entirely on Spider. So I cranked that out in 2 days. Then champion training came back once again. Worked on that in conjunction with a little bit of the event dungeon with a relatively low milestone. It didn't take, I guess it only took 2 days out of the 3 days to get that one done. Then I wrapped up champion training, and then I was basically done at that point. I think by this point champion chase had happened as well, so I was sitting there at like 1400-ish points, and so I had time to do Minotaur, which is really, really fun and really rare nowadays, so I was happy to do that. I did have to farm to the first milestone of the second Gear Hunters event, so you can see there I switched back to the event dungeon just a little bit because there was a dragon tournament going on there, but I didn't need all 40 of these points. That's one of the things that I skipped, and so it made no sense to run a little bit of dragon just to get 500 divers points, so I opted once again just to farm the event dungeon. There's only a couple more weeks before it goes away, so I wanted to shoot my shot, see if I can work on some chronophage. And then once I finished that, I went straight back to Minotaur, and that's what I've been working on for the past few days, just because I didn't have to do anything else relative to the Titan event except wait for the last day of the Fusion warm-up, where we would get the last 30 points that I specifically needed. So yeah, hopefully this deep dive has been helpful for you in terms of just, overall understanding of how an endgame player, despite being free to play, approaches Titan events in general, but also just a better understanding of what the events were in this Titan event, and perhaps we can project these forward into future Titan events. I don't necessarily plan to do this kind of summary video after every single Titan event, but if that is something that you guys would like to see more often going forward, then do let me know in the comment section down below. Like I said at the beginning, if you do want more of the details about the delta in terms of silver and gems and shards relative to this Titan event, then check out my post on my community tab page where I go into a lot more detail talking about that specific aspect of pursuing this Titan event. As always, if you did find this video helpful, then be sure to hit that like button down below. It really does help out the channel. And feel free to hit the subscribe button down below as well, if and only if you're enjoying the content overall on the channel for more content just like this one in the future. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.